welcome to the Original Gangsters Patreon members only. And today I want to talk about the Connecticut Gambino crew and John Gotti and kind of dig a little deeper beyond a famous soundbite and give some insight, but also some like nitty gritty, never really known from from the public about how Tommy Debrizzi, who was the Connecticut mob capo that ended up in the trunk of his car in the winter of 1988, how that happened. And most people don't even know really that the Debrizzi hit was connected to this kind of famous soundbite that everybody, or I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people have heard from John Gotti. It was in his trial, and it's been one of those things that's made it onto a lot of documentaries and stuff that you can see online or on History Channel or Netflix. It was the comment that he made about how somebody, in this case it was Tommy Debrizzi, the only reason I'm killing this guy is because he didn't come when I called. Something along those lines. So we'll try to find the maybe we'll try to find the soundbite and interject it here. But it was a famous kind of Gotti rant where he was talking about somebody who wasn't showing up when he was told to show up, and it had been 3 times, and Gotti was like, you know why this guy's dying? He's dying. He didn't do anything wrong except not come when I called. So that's the famous soundbite, but I want to talk about how that came about. So Tommy Debrizzi, and I want to connect it to a video we did here a couple of weeks ago related to Frankie Piccolo. I'm really getting in. It was a Gambino capo before for Connecticut before Tommy Debrizzi. If you haven't noticed, if you're following my content over the last year or so, I've developed quite a bit of sourcing in Connecticut, and it's a fun place to go and research and to dig around in. It's so diverse. You have all these different crime families that are operating there, and they're kind of forgotten about because Connecticut's kind of, all due respect to the people in Connecticut, kind of easy to forget about in the shadow of bigger cities like New York or Boston or Chicago or Philadelphia. But nonetheless, it's got a very, very riveting history and in terms of LCN in Connecticut, and I'm just really enjoying it, learning more about it, getting my hands on more FBI files, more DEA files, getting more ex-members of law enforcement, guys on the street to kind of school me on the history there. So Tommy Debrizzi sets up Frankie Piccolo to be murdered. We went over that again a week or two ago. He was murdered in the north end of Bridgeport in September 1981 over issues with Castellano that eventually lead, or the faith that was lost by Castellano allowing the Genovese to kill Piccolo plants the seed for this distrust in the Gambino family that leads to Castellano's murder and Gotti's ascension. And Debrizzi is that bridge between the Castellano era and the Gotti era in Connecticut. So Debrizzi is the guy that made the phone call at the phone, allegedly made the phone call at the phone booth in front of the Bagel King that Frank Piccolo was killed at. He was killed in the phone booth, and the call came from Tommy Debrizzi. And then, according to the government, some Genovese sent hitman gunned him down. Gus Curcio was charged with the crime, but beat the case. And Diamond Dave Byfield, who was the head of the Hells Angels in Bridgeport, was another person that was alleged to be involved, but wasn't ever charged. Dan just died actually a couple weeks ago, so R.I.P. to Diamond Dan. So Debrizzi takes over, And one of the things that Gotti and I think maybe Castellano at the end had done was put Tommy Gambino in charge of things in Connecticut. Tommy didn't live in Connecticut. He was, a mafia prince from New York, Carlo Gambino's son, more of a white collar racketeer, but he was given responsibility over the Connecticut rackets and specifically Tommy Debrizzi. He puts his own guy, a guy by the name of Skinny Phil Scalzo. He puts him in, or he dispatches him to Connecticut on a regular basis. And Scalzo might have actually had residence. I'm not sure. He's a Bronx guy, but he might have had residence in Connecticut at one point. He had a place called Cafe Cappuccino that became a check-in spot in Connecticut, and that was Tommy Gambino's nerve center in terms of corporate or the main office would go through Skinny Phil Scalzo. But Debrizzi ran the day-to-day operations in Connecticut, and when there was the changeover in leadership from Castellano to Gotti, there was a kind of a scramble to make sure that everybody that had been loyal to Castellano was now loyal to Gotti. And, Tommy Gambino was really the first person he had, because that was his uncle, I believe. And Castellano was. And Tommy Gambino gave his loyalty to Gotti, despite the fact of how Gotti took power, and getting everybody lined up to pay what they had to pay. So Debrizzi is ostensibly doing that, but there is dissension within the ranks, within his own ranks, and a kind of low-key Connecticut legend, low-key Connecticut gangland legend named Eddie Rialino, Eddie Rye, was, thinking about trying to politic his way into being Debrizzi's replacement. A lot of people had already dubbed Tony Magali was going to take over for whenever Debrizzi retired, whether it was by his own volition or was retired via finding himself into the trunk of that car. I think the natural order of things had always been assumed that Tony the Genius Magali was going to take over. Magal goes all the way back to Piccolo. Tony the Genius's restaurant, Tony's, was a daily headquarters of Piccolo. One of Piccolo's top lieutenants, Cosmo Sandalo, was Tony the Genius's uncle. And it's interesting also that when people see the nickname Tony the Genius, they assume that he was a brilliant mind, but it was an ironic nickname, that he was more of just a knuckle dragger, and they called him the Genius because he wasn't so smart, allegedly. So Eddie Rialino doesn't like that succession plan. And he thinks that he can curry favor with Gotti and Gravano by, for a lack of a better term, snitching on Rialino and Magali. So he goes to Gravano, Eddie Rye does, and says, Tommy Debrizzi isn't giving you what he owes you. He's holding out. He's skimming. Gravano goes back to Gotti and tells him this. And Gotti calls for Debrizzi to come and explain himself. And he didn't just call once, he calls twice, he calls 3 times, and Debrizzi is nowhere to be found. That sends Gotti into that famous rant that ends up with Debrizzi being killed, allegedly by Tony Magali. But Rialino, it was all for, from his perspective and what his end game was, it's all for naught. Because Magali allegedly arranges for Debrizzi's murder. and takes over. Debrizzi's last seen leaving a Connecticut Howard Johnson, old time people that are older will remember the Howard Johnsons that were everywhere. They were like a motel on almost, every couple corners. They had restaurants and bars in there, and he had gone to Howard Johnson's, and then he borrowed someone's car to go run an errand or go meet someone, and that's the car that he was found in. Found about a week later. He was disappeared January 30th, 88, and was found, I think, February 6th or 7th. But Eddie Rialino doesn't work out for him. And in fact, the Debrizzi guys are pissed at him for ratting out Debrizzi, and he's almost killed. A guy named Jimmy DelMargio, who they called the Patent Leather Kid. Love the nickname. Great nickname. I guess he was a former boxer that went by the Patent Leather Kid. He shoots Rialino 5 times. Rialino ends up surviving it. But nonetheless, Tony Magali was the guy that ascended to being the boss of that crew. He eventually becomes, I believe, acting underboss of the whole Borgata of the Gambinos. He died about 10 years ago of cancer at a pretty relatively young age. And Dino DePreta, allegedly now Baldino, is the Gambino skipper in Connecticut. But I wanted to tell everyone about the backstory of that famous John Gotti rant about killing somebody for no other reason but that he wouldn't show up to explain to Gotti something that Gotti wanted explained. So, we love giving you added context and insight here. I hope this gave that to you. We got a new interview that I'm hoping that we're going to release soon about the Idaho murders. This is non-OC, so we're going to kind of mix it up a little bit. Have an expert on those college murders from Idaho, the 4 people that were slaughtered. I think it was in 22 or 23, and the trial's going to be coming up, and we're going to get the insight into that soon. And then we're going to get you some more exclusive director's cuts of interviews that we release on YouTube. So please check back. We'll have some more content here on Patreon. Scott Burnstein, Patreon members only. I'm out.